Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Tonight I'm bringing you 10 deeply disturbing true cruise ship horror stories that will make you think twice about every ocean voyage you've ever considered. These are not fictional tales, but genuine accounts from women who experienced something absolutely terrifying during what should have been celebratory girls' trips at sea. Each story has been collected from first-hand witnesses who survived these horrifying ordeals and were brave enough to share their experiences so others might recognize the warning signs. The luxury cruise ships we trust to provide safe entertainment can conceal dangers we never imagine. From supernatural entities that haunt the decks to predators who exploit the isolation of international waters. If you value authentic horror content based on real events, subscribe to Mr. Nightveil and hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the most unsettling true stories. After you hear these chilling testimonies, share your own disturbing cruise experiences in the comments below. We want to create a community where people can alert others about the terrors that hide beneath the surface of paradise vacations. Now steel yourself as we dive into 10 encounters that transformed ordinary party cruises into absolute nightmares. My name is Bryn, and I'm 24 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in June 2019, and I still can't look at photographs the same way. It was supposed to be the perfect graduation trip. Me and 5 of my closest friends from college finally celebrating 4 years of late-night study sessions, terrible cafeteria food, and somehow making it through with our degrees intact. We'd booked a 7-day Eastern Caribbean cruise departing from Miami, hitting Nassau, St. Thomas, and Grand Cayman. The ship was massive. One of those floating cities with waterfalls in the atrium and restaurants on every deck. We'd saved for 2 years to afford it, splitting a cabin between all 6 of us like sardines. But none of us cared. We were free, we were young, and we had a week of sunshine and frozen drinks ahead of us. The first day was chaos in the best possible way. Embarkation in Miami took forever, thousands of passengers shuffling through security and check-in. But once we were aboard, the excitement hit us like a wave. The ship's horn blasted as we pulled away from port, and we ran up to the Lido deck to watch the Miami skyline shrink behind us. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen and chlorine from the nearby pools. I had my camera out the entire time, one of those actual digital cameras, because I was trying to be artsy about documenting the trip. My friends teased me about it, said I should just use my phone like a normal person. But I loved the weight of it in my hands, the satisfying click of the shutter. We spent that first evening exploring every inch of the ship we could access. The promenade with its duty-free shops and cafes, the massive theater where they do shows each night, the casino with its flashing lights and cigarette smoke smell that made us wrinkle our noses, the multiple pools and hot tubs scattered across different decks. We took photos everywhere. Silly ones, posed ones, candid shots of each other laughing. The ship had this beautiful spiral staircase in the main atrium, all gleaming brass and red carpet, and we must have taken 50 pictures there alone. The lighting was gorgeous, these huge chandeliers casting warm light across the marble floors. It wasn't until that night, back in our cabin, that Winter noticed her. We were all crowded onto 2 beds, scrolling through the day's photos on my camera's screen, reminiscing about moments that had happened just hours ago like they were precious memories. Winter grabbed the camera from my hands and zoomed in on one of the atrium photos. There, in the background behind us, stood a woman we didn't recognize. She wore a red dress, the kind of vintage style you'd see in old movies, fitted at the waist and flaring out at the knees. Her skin looked pale, almost translucent in the lighting. Her face was slightly out of focus, like she'd moved just as I pressed the shutter, creating this blur that made her features hard to distinguish. We laughed it off at first. The ship had over 3,000 passengers. Of course, there'd be random people in our backgrounds. But then Winter kept scrolling, and the woman appeared in another photo. Then another. In the picture we'd taken at the pool, she was visible through the glass doors in the background. In our restaurant shot from dinner, she was seated alone 3 tables behind us, that red dress unmistakable. In the photo outside the theater, she stood at the railing of the deck above, looking down at where we posed. Always slightly out of focus, always just at the edge of the frame. Aylin suggested maybe she was following us, some creepy passenger fixated on our group. The idea made my skin crawl, but it seemed more rational than the alternative none of us wanted to voice. We decided we'd try to find her the next day, confront her if we had to, or at least report her to security if she was genuinely stalking us. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was underwater, the ocean pressing down on me from all sides, and I could see the surface above but couldn't reach it. Something was holding my ankle, pulling me deeper into darkness that had no bottom. The next day was our first port stop, Nassau. We'd booked a beach excursion, one of those perfect Caribbean beaches with water so clear you could see your feet on the sand below. I brought my camera again, determined to get better shots, happier memories to replace the unsettling feeling the woman in red had given us. We swam. We drank Bahama Mamas that were far too strong. We laid in the sun until our skin turned pink despite the sunscreen we'd slathered on. For a few hours, I forgot about the photographs entirely. But that evening, back on the ship, I made the mistake of reviewing the day's photos. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the camera. She was there, in the beach photos. The woman in red, standing at the tree line in the background while we played in the waves. In the shot of us at the beach bar, she was visible through the window, that red dress impossible to miss. She'd been on the island with us, or something had. Winter saw my face go pale and grabbed the camera from me. Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath followed by a string of curses. We gathered the others and showed them. The jokes from the night before died instantly. This wasn't a passenger following us. We'd taken a private excursion, a small group tour boat to a secluded beach. We'd seen everyone who was there. None of them had worn a red dress. The beach had been hot, everyone in swimsuits and cover-ups, shorts and tank tops. A vintage red dress would have stood out like blood on snow. Aylin insisted we show the photos to someone official. We found our cabin steward, a kind man from the Philippines named Mauricio, who always left towel animals on our beds. When we showed him the picture, his face changed. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by something that looked like recognition and fear. He asked us which deck we were, staying on, what our cabin number was. Then he told us something that made my blood run cold. 10 years ago, in 2009, a woman had drowned during a tender boat accident on this ship's route to Grand Cayman. The small boats that ferry passengers from ship to shore when the ship can't dock directly. One had capsized in rough waters. Most passengers were rescued, but one woman had been pulled under. They never recovered her body. She'd been traveling alone, celebrating her 30th birthday. She'd been known for always wearing red. Mauricio asked to see more photos. We scrolled through them together, and his hands were shaking as badly as mine had been. He pointed at one of the theater shots. The woman in red was clearer in this one, visible in a seat several rows behind where we'd posed in the aisle. He told us that was near cabin 7243. The cabin the drowned woman had stayed in. He blessed himself quickly, a gesture I hadn't seen anyone make outside of movies, and told us he'd report it to guest services, but advised us to perhaps conduct a small memorial for her. Light a candle, Say a prayer. Acknowledge her presence respectfully." Then he left quickly, his cart of cleaning supplies rattling as he hurried down the corridor. We didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the ship's hull, every distant sound of pipes groaning or the air conditioning humming, set us on edge. I kept my camera off, couldn't bear to look at any more photos. But around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Dripping, slow and steady, water hitting the cabin floor. The sound was too loud, too deliberate to be condensation from the air conditioning. I opened my eyes and wished I hadn't. The doors to our small balcony were closed, curtains drawn, but water was seeping underneath them. Not a small leak, but steady streams running across the industrial carpet, soaking it dark. The smell hit me next. Not the chlorinated pool water or clean ocean spray, but something organic and rotten, like seaweed left too long in the sun, like things that decompose in salt water where the sun can't reach them. I wanted to scream, wanted to wake the others, but my throat had closed up with terror. The curtains moved slightly, and I saw her. The woman in red stood on our balcony, visible through the gap in the curtains. Water ran from her hair, from the hem of her dress, pooling around her feet. Her skin had that same pale, translucent quality from the photos. But up close, I could see it was wrong, bloated and loose like it had spent too long submerged. She was looking directly at me through the window, and even though her face was distorted, I could see her mouth moving, whispering something I couldn't hear through the glass. She raised one hand, and her fingers left wet marks on the window as she traced numbers. 7, 2, 4, 3. The cabin number Mauricio had mentioned. Then she placed her palm flat against the glass, and I could see through her hand to the ocean. Beyond, like she was made of water herself, held together by nothing but rage or longing or some emotion the dead shouldn't still possess. I must have made some sound because Winter woke up beside me. She saw the water first, then followed my frozen stare to the balcony. Her scream finally released mine, and within seconds, all 6 of us were awake. Lights blazing, staring at the empty balcony. The curtains hung still. The water was real, though, soaking into the carpet, cold when we touched it, smelling of deep ocean and decay. The numbers were still visible on the glass, traced in condensation that shouldn't have formed on the outside of the window. Security came, then maintenance, then a very nervous-looking guest services representative who kept apologizing and talking about pressure differentials and drainage systems. But none of them could explain the numbers on the glass or the smell that lingered even after they shampooed the carpet. None of them could explain why the water had only appeared in our cabin and nowhere else on the deck. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, we asked Mauricio for help. He took us to the ship's small chapel, a quiet room on deck 5 that most passengers never visited. We lit candles, all 6 of us. And Aylin, who'd been raised Catholic even though she never went to church anymore, said a prayer for the woman who drowned. We didn't know her name, but we acknowledged her, spoke to her like she could hear us, told her we were sorry for what happened to her, that we hoped she'd find peace. I don't know if it worked. I don't know if any of it was real or if we all experienced some kind of shared delusion brought on by stress and too much sun and alcohol. But I took photos for the rest of the cruise, and the woman in red never appeared in another frame. The water didn't come back. My dreams of drowning stopped. When we docked back in Miami 7 days after we departed, we practically ran off the ship, desperate for solid ground that didn't move beneath our feet. I still have all those photos. I've never deleted them, though I've never shown them to anyone outside our group either. Winter refuses to talk about it. Aylin convinced herself it was mass hysteria. The others have their own ways of explaining it away. But I know what I saw. I know whose hand pressed against that window, leaving behind the number of a cabin where someone had spent their last night alive before the ocean claimed them. I haven't been on a ship since. Haven't even been able to go to the beach without feeling watched. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. Some presences, once acknowledged, mark you in ways that don't wash off. And sometimes the dead don't rest easy in their watery graves. Sometimes they walk the decks of the ships where they spent their final happy moments, looking for someone to finally see them, to finally remember that they were here, that they mattered, that their story didn't end the way it should have. My name is Miley, and I'm 28 years old. What happened to us in March 2021 still makes me check my skin obsessively, still makes me afraid of anything that claims to be natural or organic. We were 7 girls on a bachelorette party cruise celebrating my best friend Raven's upcoming wedding. She'd chosen a Western Caribbean route departing from Fort Lauderdale. 5 nights hitting Cozumel, Belize, and Roatan. None of us had seen each other much during the pandemic, and this trip felt like reclaiming something we'd lost, like finally breathing after holding our breath for a year. Raven wanted everything perfect, every moment planned and scheduled. She'd booked us spa appointments for day 2, some luxury seaweed body wrap treatment that promised detoxification and skin rejuvenation. The brochure made it look heavenly. Women lying peacefully while wrapped in emerald green seaweed, their faces serene. We laughed about how we'd probably just fall asleep and drool on the fancy spa pillows. The first day passed exactly as you'd expect. We explored the ship, claimed our spots by the main pool, drank cocktails that came in pineapples with little umbrellas, and took enough photos to fill 3 phones. The sun felt incredible after months of being trapped indoors. That night, we dressed up for dinner at the ship's steakhouse. The kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who refilled your water glass before you realized it was empty. Raven glowed with happiness, kept saying this was exactly what she needed before the wedding stress really kicked in. We toasted to her future, to friendship, to leaving the nightmare of the past year behind us. The wine was expensive and tasted like it. Smooth and rich. Everything felt right. Everything felt safe. The spa was on deck 11, tucked away in the forward section where everything went quiet and smelled like eucalyptus and lavender. We showed up at 10 in the morning, slightly hungover but excited, wearing the plush white robes they'd left in our cabins. The spa coordinator, a woman with an accent I couldn't quite place, checked us in and led us through the facility. Soft music played from hidden speakers, something with ocean sounds and flutes that would normally relax me, but somehow felt off that morning. Maybe it was playing just slightly too fast, the tempo wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The treatment rooms were separated by frosted glass, each containing a massage table and dim lighting from salt lamps in the corners. The seaweed arrived in large stainless steel bowls, and immediately something about it bothered me. The color was wrong. Too dark, almost black in places, instead of the vibrant green from the brochure photos. The texture looked thick and ropey, clumped together in ways that reminded me of hair clogged in a drain. The smell was intense. Not the clean ocean scent I expected, but something deeper. Richer, almost rotten underneath the surface notes of salt and iodine. When I mentioned it to our technician, a young woman who wouldn't meet my eyes, she laughed nervously and said it was a special blend, harvested from deeper waters, very exclusive. The way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been told exactly what to say if anyone asked. They had us lie face down on the tables and began spreading the seaweed across our backs, our legs, our arms. It felt cold at first, then immediately too warm, like it was generating its own heat. The texture against my skin made me want to squirm away from it. It wasn't smooth like kelp should be, but rough and almost sticky, adhering to my skin in a way that felt wrong. I heard Raven in the next room laughing about how weird it felt, trying to keep the mood light. But her voice had an edge to it that suggested she was as uncomfortable as I was. The technician wrapped me in heated blankets, cocooning me completely, then told me to relax for 40 minutes. She left the room quickly, and I heard the door lock click behind her. That detail stuck with me later. Why would she lock it? For the first 10 minutes, I tried to relax like we'd paid good money for. I focused on my breathing, tried to ignore the strange texture of the seaweed against my skin, told myself this was normal and I was being paranoid. But then the warmth increased, became uncomfortable, then painful. My skin started to itch, a deep, crawling sensation that felt like it was coming from underneath the surface. I called out for the technician, but the music must have been louder than I thought because no one responded. The itching intensified into burning. I tried to move my arms to unwrap myself, but the blankets were tucked so tightly I couldn't get leverage. That's when I felt something move against my back. Not the sliding of seaweed as I shifted position, but deliberate movement. Something writhing independently beneath the wrappings. I screamed then, really screamed, and I heard other voices join mine from the adjacent rooms. Someone was pounding on their door. Glass shattered somewhere. The spa coordinator rushed in, and her face when she saw me told me this wasn't normal, wasn't expected, wasn't part of any treatment. She tore the blankets off me, and I saw my arms. The skin had developed raised welts everywhere the seaweed had touched, angry red lines that looked like burns or acid damage. But worse than the welts was what I could see moving underneath them. Tracking lines beneath my skin like something was burrowing through the layers. Raven was screaming in the next room, a sound I'd never heard her make, high and terrified and pain-filled. They got us to the medical bay within minutes, all 7 of us showing the same symptoms to varying degrees. Raven had it worst, her back and legs completely covered in the rash, her skin literally cracking in places, small splits opening up like her body couldn't contain whatever was inside it. The ship's doctor looked horrified, immediately called for quarantine protocol, started pumping us full of antihistamines and steroids and anything else he could think of that might slow down whatever was happening. He kept asking the spa coordinator what was in the seaweed mixture, where they'd sourced it from, and she just kept crying and saying she didn't know, that a new supplier had provided it, that they'd used it on passengers yesterday with no problems. By evening, 3 of us, including Raven, were showing signs of something the doctor had never seen before. Our skin felt wrong, too tight and too loose at the same time, and when I touched my arm, I could feel things moving underneath. Definite shapes shifting through muscle and tissue. Raven was sobbing. Kept saying she couldn't get married like this, that something was growing inside her. And we couldn't tell her she was wrong because we could see it too. Her shoulder blade area was distended, swollen in a way that didn't match inflammation, like something was literally pushing outward from the inside. The doctor sedated her, sedated all 3 of us actually, said we needed to stay calm or our heart rates would spread whatever this was through our systems faster. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of Raven screaming despite the sedation. The medical bay lights were fluorescent bright, and I saw the doctor and 3 nurses in what looked like hazmat suits surrounding her bed. I couldn't see exactly what they were doing, but I heard the wet tearing sound, heard Raven's screams cut off into whimpering, heard one of the nurses say something about eggs in a voice that was trying to stay professional, but couldn't hide the disgust and horror. My own skin chose that moment to split open along my forearm, a sensation like nothing I'd ever felt, and something pushed its way out. It was thin and translucent, maybe 3 inches long, segmented like a worm, but with small appendages along its body. It writhed on my arm for a second before the nurse grabbed it with forceps and dropped it into a specimen container. I passed out then, my brain just refusing to process what I'd seen. The next 48 hours exist in my memory as fragments. Coast Guard helicopters, being transferred to a mainland hospital while still on IV sedation. A team from the CDC in full protective gear examining us. More things being removed from beneath our skin, the doctors explaining they were some form of parasitic organism, possibly a deep-sea species that had never been documented before. They showed us images under microscopes, tried to explain the life cycle they were theorizing, but I couldn't focus on the science. I could only focus on the fact that things had been growing inside me, feeding on me, using my body as an incubator for whatever they would have become if the doctors hadn't removed them. Raven spent 2 weeks in the facility. 3 of us were released after 10 days once they were certain they'd removed all the organisms and our skin was healing. But healing is a relative term. The scarring is permanent. My forearms and back looked like I was in a fire. Patches of skin that healed wrong, too smooth and shiny in some places, ridged and rough in others. Raven's back is worse, requires a special compression garment she has to wear daily to manage the damaged tissue. She postponed the wedding for 6 months, and when it finally happened, she wore a dress with a high back and long sleeves. The photos are beautiful, but I know what's hidden underneath that silk and lace. The cruise line settled with us out of court. The spa was permanently closed, the entire treatment menu suspended pending investigation. The CDC identified the organisms as a previously unknown species of parasitic algae, possibly from deep-sea thermal vents, though they couldn't determine how it ended up in a commercial spa product. The supplier the spa coordinator mentioned disappeared. The company dissolved. No trace of who actually provided the seaweed. We have a lawyer who says it smells like illegal harvesting, possibly from protected marine environments, possibly from areas humans have no business disturbing. I can't take baths anymore. The feeling of being submerged, even in clean water, triggers panic attacks. I check my skin constantly, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that they didn't get everything, that something might still be dormant inside me, waiting to emerge. The doctors assure me I'm clean, that the follow-up scans show nothing. But I felt those things moving under my skin. I felt them feeding on me. That's not something medication or therapy can erase. Raven doesn't talk about it anymore. She's moved on, or at least pretends she has. But I've seen her scratch at her scars when she thinks no one is looking. Seen the way she avoids the ocean now, won't even walk on the beach. The other girls from the trip, we don't keep in touch. There's an unspoken agreement that we need to forget, to pretend it was just a terrible accident and not something that suggests there are things in the deep ocean we should never bring to the surface. Things that should stay in the dark where they belong. Sometimes late at night, I research deep sea organisms. Read about the creatures that live in the Hadal zones where no light reaches, where the pressure would crush a human instantly. I read about parasites that take over their hosts, about organisms that exist in ways that violate everything we think we know about life. And I wonder what we really brought up from those depths, whether it was an accident or if something down there wanted to reach the surface, wanted to find new hosts in the warm, shallow waters where humans play. I wonder if we were just unlucky. Or if somewhere right now, another spa is using another shipment, and other women are lying on tables being wrapped in something that will change them forever. Have you ever felt something moving under your skin that shouldn't be there? Have you ever realized too late that the treatment you trusted was actually the infection. Tell me in the comments what you think was really in that seaweed, because I still don't have answers that let me sleep at night. My name is Jocelyn, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a software engineer, which means I notice patterns, inconsistencies, things that don't add up mathematically. That skill almost got me killed in October 2018, or maybe it saved my life. I still can't decide which. I was on a company retreat cruise with 4 colleagues, one of those corporate team-building things our tech startup loved to organize. We'd departed from San Diego heading down the Mexican Riviera, supposed to hit Cabo and Mazatlan, 5 days of mandatory fun mixed with strategic planning sessions. The ship was newer, one of those modern designs with glass elevators and LED lighting everywhere, the kind of vessel that felt more like a floating hotel than anything nautical. The first 2 days were standard corporate nonsense. We attended workshops about synergy and disruption, sat through presentations in conference rooms that somehow still smelled like carpet cleaner despite the ocean air outside. But I kept myself entertained by exploring the ship's layout during breaks, mapping it mentally the way I'd map code architecture. I'm that person who needs to understand how systems work, how pieces fit together, and this ship was fascinating from an engineering perspective. 12 passenger decks, multiple atriums, a promenade that circled Deck 7, pools stacked vertically with plumbing I could only imagine the complexity of. Except something didn't match up. I first noticed it on day 3 while riding the glass elevators with Mariam from accounting. We went from Deck 6 to Deck 12, but I was watching the deck indicators, counting the stops. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14. I hit the stop button immediately, made Mariam jump with a sudden halt. I asked her if she saw what I saw, pointed at the panel. She looked at me like I was having a stroke, said obviously it went 6 through 14. What was I talking about? But I'd watched the numbers. There'd been no 13 displayed, but there'd been 12 stops, not 11. An extra floor existed that the elevator wouldn't acknowledge. I became obsessed with it for the rest of that day. During the afternoon strategic planning session I was supposed to be contributing to, I was instead sketching the ship's deck layout on my notepad, calculating vertical distances between floors based on the window placements I'd observed from outside. The math didn't work. There was too much space between Deck 12 and Deck 14, at least 15 feet of vertical distance unaccounted for. A hidden maintenance floor, maybe. But why hide it? Why skip the number in the elevators, but still have the physical space exist? That night, I couldn't sleep. The problem gnawed at me like a bug in code that I couldn't locate. Around 2 in the morning, I got dressed and went exploring. The ship was quiet at that hour, just the constant hum of engines and the occasional crew member pushing a cart of laundry or room service trays. I found an emergency stairwell on the port side, one of those utilitarian spaces with concrete walls and metal railings, harsh fluorescent lighting. I climbed from Deck 10 upward, counting steps carefully. Between Deck 12 and Deck 14, there was a landing, a door. Unmarked, plain metal, the kind that's supposed to be locked and led to crew-only areas. But when I tried the handle, it opened. The air that came through was wrong immediately. Colder than it should be, and the pressure felt different, like my ears needed to pop even though I hadn't changed altitude significantly. The lighting beyond was dim, not the fluorescence of the stairwell, but some kind of ambient glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves, a pale greenish illumination that reminded me of old computer monitors. I should have turned back. Every horror movie I'd ever seen said turn back. But I'm a software engineer, and we don't leave bugs unfixed. I stepped through, The corridor beyond shouldn't have existed. The geometry was immediately wrong in ways I can't fully articulate even now. The hallway stretched forward, but also seemed to curve in on itself. Like I was looking at it through a fisheye lens, except I wasn't using a lens. This was direct observation. The walls met the ceiling at angles that weren't quite 90 degrees, creating a sense of vertigo. I put my hand against the wall to steady myself, and the surface felt strange, slightly yielding, warmer than metal should be, almost organic. The ship's normal sounds were gone here. No engine vibration, no distant music from the nightclub. Nothing but my breathing and the soft sound of my shoes on carpet that looked standard, but felt spongy and alive under my feet. I walked forward because going back meant admitting I couldn't solve this, couldn't understand it, and my pride wouldn't allow that. The corridor seemed infinite, extending far beyond what the ship's actual dimensions could contain. I passed cabin doors, standard-looking with number placards, except the numbers made no sense. 13A7, 1A32, 1301. Mathematical impossibilities used as room numbers. I tried one handle, the door to 13P9, and it opened into a cabin that looked normal at first glance. Standard cruise ship stateroom, bed made with military precision, desk, bathroom visible through an open door. But the window showed ocean at the wrong angle. Water flowing upward instead of the horizon line I should see. And the shadows in the room didn't match the light source, pointing in directions that violated basic physics. I backed out quickly and found Mariam standing in the hallway behind me. Except it couldn't be Mariam because I'd left her asleep in our shared cabin 4 decks below. This version wore the same pajamas I'd seen her wearing when I left. But her face was wrong. Like someone had described Mariam to an artist who'd never actually seen her, and they'd gotten the proportions slightly off. Her eyes were too far apart by maybe a quarter inch, her smile too wide, showing too many teeth. She asked if I was lost, and her voice was Mariam's voice, but played backwards and forwards simultaneously, creating a dissonant harmony that made my teeth ache. I ran. Just turned and sprinted back down the corridor toward where the stairwell door should be. But the hallway kept extending, kept unfolding ahead of me like a rendering error, like when a game glitches and textures repeat infinitely. I passed the same cabin doors over and over, or maybe they were different doors with the same impossible numbers. I couldn't tell. Behind me, I heard multiple footsteps now. Not just Mariam's. And when I risked a glance back, I saw 3 versions of myself chasing me, all wearing what I was wearing, all with my face but wrong in small ways, asymmetrical, uncanny. They were smiling, all of them, and I wasn't smiling. That's how I knew they weren't reflections. I found a door that said 13ME in plain letters instead of numbers and threw myself through it without thinking. The room beyond was someone's cabin, currently occupied. I was sitting at the desk, my back to the door, writing in a journal. I watched myself writing and couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was seeing. The version of me at the desk turned around slowly, and her face was tired in ways mine wasn't yet. Older, marked by experiences I hadn't lived. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She said she remembered this, remembered being the one who came through the door, that I needed to read what she'd written before it was too late. The journal was filled with my handwriting documenting events I hadn't experienced. A fight with Mariam that hadn't happened yet about something I'd apparently say at tomorrow's meeting. A shipboard romance with someone named Dax from engineering that I hadn't met. A presentation disaster. A storm that would hit in 3 days. My promotion to lead developer. All dated weeks and months ahead of October 2018, detailed accounts of a future I was supposed to live. The other me said this was Deck 13, where time didn't work correctly, where past and future overlapped, where the ship's architecture folded through dimensions it wasn't designed for. She said she'd been trapped here for subjective years, even though only hours passed in normal time, that I needed to leave now before the space solidified around me. The lights flickered and everything shifted. The cabin multiplied, became 4 cabins occupying the same space simultaneously, overlapping transparently like bad Photoshop layers. I saw Miriam in one version, unconscious on the floor. I saw myself in another version much older, gray hair, screaming silently at nothing. I saw in a third version the cabin completely flooded with dark water. Something massive pressing against the window from outside, something with too many eyes and geometries that hurt to perceive. The fourth version was just empty, but the emptiness felt malevolent, like absence given hostile intent. The other me grabbed my shoulders, her hands cold and solid and definitely real, and she shoved me backward hard. I fell through the door I'd entered through, landed in the corridor, and the geometry snapped back to almost normal. Almost, because the angles were still wrong, the walls still seemed to breathe. But I could see the stairwell door now glowing like an exit sign. I ran for it, didn't look back even when I heard things behind me, plural. Many things that sounded like they were moving in ways bodies shouldn't move, joints bending in extra directions, flesh sliding against itself wetly. I hit the stairwell door at full speed, burst through into familiar fluorescent lighting and right angles and physics that made sense. The door slammed shut behind me, and when I immediately tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. Locked solid as if it had never been open. I looked at my phone, and only 20 minutes had passed since I'd left my cabin, even though I'd experienced at least an hour in that impossible space. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the railing as I descended back to Deck 10. Miriam was still asleep when I got back to our cabin. Real Miriam with her face the correct proportions, breathing normally. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the desk chair and researched the ship's construction history on the terrible Wi-Fi, found nothing about a Deck 13, found nothing to explain what I'd experienced. But I did find reports, buried deep in maritime forums, about this specific vessel. Passengers reporting strange occurrences, time discrepancies, people seeing doubles of themselves. One detailed account from someone who claimed they'd found a hidden deck where the laws of physics didn't apply consistently, where they'd met a future version of themselves who'd been trapped there. That post was from 2015. 3 years before my cruise. The rest of the trip I avoided the elevators, took stairs on the opposite side of the ship, kept Miriam close and watched her face constantly to make sure the proportions stayed correct. During our final strategic meeting, I said something critical about Dax from engineering's proposal, even though I'd never spoken to him before. And Miriam got angry exactly as the journal had predicted. Small events from those written pages kept occurring, little moments of future becoming present, and each one made me feel sicker. I was following a script I'd read, or maybe reading the script made it happen. I couldn't determine causality. I've never been on a cruise since. I've never been able to look at architectural plans the same way either, always wondering if there are spaces between the spaces, floors that exist but aren't numbered. Places where reality gets thin and something else bleeds through. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that other version of me is still trapped on Deck 13. If she's still there, waiting in that cabin, writing in that journal, documenting a future that includes me reading her words. I wonder if there are infinite versions stacked in that space. All of us who made the mistake of being too curious, too determined to solve the pattern, to understand the system. I wonder if I actually escaped, or if I'm still there and this is just another layer of the impossibility, another iteration in a loop I can't perceive from inside. Have you ever found a space that shouldn't exist in a place you thought you knew completely? Have you ever met a version of yourself that knew things you hadn't experienced yet? Drop your thoughts below, because part of me needs to know if anyone else has seen what I saw, or if I'm still on that deck trying to convince myself I made it out. My name is Logan, and I'm 22 years old. What I'm about to share happened in March 2015 during spring break, and it's the reason I can't hear the words hide and seek without feeling physically sick. I was part of a sorority trip, 8 of us celebrating the end of midterms on a Caribbean cruise out of Galveston. The ship was older, one of those vessels that had been refurbished multiple times, but still showed its age in the worn carpeting and the way certain corridors smelled faintly of mildew no matter how much they cleaned. We didn't care, though. We were young and free and determined to make this the trip we'd talk about for years. I wish we'd been talking about it for different reasons. The first night was everything you'd expect from college girls on a cruise. We hit the nightclub on deck 12, danced until our feet hurt, drank drinks with names we couldn't pronounce. The music was so loud, I could feel it vibrating in my chest, the bass matching my heartbeat. Around midnight, we met 2 guys at the bar. Brothers, they said, maybe mid-20s, attractive in that effortless way some people are. They introduced themselves as Princeton and Creed, said they were traveling together, taking a break from working in their family business. They bought us a round of shots, then another, and they were funny and charming and exactly the kind of distraction we wanted. Princeton had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and Creed had a quieter intensity that was equally magnetic. We ended up closing down the club with them, that strange bonding that happens at 3 in the morning when everyone's guard is down and everything seems like the best idea you've ever had. That's when Princeton suggested the game. Hide and seek, but played throughout the entire ship, using the crew corridors and maintenance areas they claimed to have access to. He said they'd done it on other cruises, that it was the most fun you could have at sea, that once you played it, you'd never forget it. The way he said that last part should have warned me. The emphasis on never forget carrying weight, I was too drunk to interpret correctly. Veronica, our group's de facto leader, laughed and asked what we'd win if we were the last ones found. Princeton's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something flat and cold passing across them like a cloud over the sun. He said we'd win the right to leave. Veronica thought that was hilarious. We all did. The rules seemed simple enough. We'd split into pairs, seekers and hiders rotating. Princeton and Creed would seek first, give us 10 minutes to hide anywhere on the ship we could access, and they'd use walkie-talkies they somehow had to coordinate. Last pair found would win. They handed out the radios, cheap plastic things that probably came from a dollar store, and told us to keep Channel 3 open so we could hear when pairs were found and know when the game was ending. It seemed elaborate and exciting, the kind of story we'd tell back at the sorority house about our wild cruise adventure. We scattered at 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone before Veronica and I ran toward the stern of the ship, looking for the perfect hiding spot. The ship was mostly empty at that hour. Just the background hum of engines and air conditioning, our footsteps echoing on the metal stairs as we descended toward deck 4. We found a storage area near the theater, the door unlocked, filled with stacked chairs and lighting equipment. It seemed perfect, dark and tucked away, easy to stay hidden for a long time. We wedged ourselves behind a rack of costumes, smelling like mothballs and old fabric, and waited. The walkie-talkie crackled after maybe 15 minutes. Princeton's voice came through, playful, announcing they'd found the first pair. He gave their names, 2 girls from our group, said they were heading to base, which was apparently some crew area on deck 3. Veronica and I high-fived silently, confident in our hiding spot. Then maybe 10 minutes later, the radio crackled again. But this time, instead of Princeton's announcement, We heard screaming. One of the girls from the first pair, her voice high and terrified, cut off abruptly mid-shriek. Then static. Then Princeton's voice again, calm, saying the first pair had been eliminated, wouldn't be playing anymore. Veronica grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. We stared at the radio like it was a snake. I whispered that maybe it was part of the game, trying to scare us. But my voice shook because I didn't believe it even as I said it. The screaming had been real. The kind of sound you can't fake. The kind that comes from actual terror or pain. Veronica wanted to leave our hiding spot, find the others, end the game. But I was afraid to move, afraid that opening the door would give away our position. We argued in whispers that grew progressively more panicked until the radio interrupted us again. The second pair had been found. This time we heard the actual encounter through someone's open radio. Running footsteps, heavy breathing, then a male voice that might have been Creed saying "gotcha." Then sounds I can't describe without getting sick, wet and heavy, followed by a girl crying and begging. The radio cut out. Princeton's voice returned, said 2 pairs down, 3 to go. And he sounded excited now, energized. He told us the game was getting interesting, that we were all doing so well, that he hoped we'd keep playing because they were having such a good time. That's when we understood this wasn't a game anymore, if it ever had been. Veronica made the decision for us, said we needed to find help, find security, find anyone. We left the storage room as quietly as we could and made our way toward the main atrium where guest services should be. The ship felt different at that hour. The cheerful daytime atmosphere completely gone, replaced by something threatening in every shadow. We saw blood on the deck 7 promenade, just drops at first, then smears like something had been dragged. The shops were all closed and dark, their windows reflecting us as we crept past like we were ghosts haunting our own deaths. We found guest services, but it was abandoned, chairs pushed back like whoever had been working had left in a hurry. The computer was still on, screen showing security camera feeds, and Veronica cycled through them while I watched the corridor behind us. She found one of our friends on a camera, saw her hiding in what looked like a supply closet, saw the door open from outside, saw Princeton enter the frame. Veronica tried to change cameras before we saw what happened next, but she wasn't fast enough. I saw enough. More than enough. The way he moved wasn't normal. Too fast and too efficient. And the glint of metal in his hand caught the camera's infrared glow. The radio crackled with pair 3 eliminated. 5 girls in our group. We'd started with 8. Veronica was crying now, trying to call 911 on her phone but getting no signal. And I was looking at the security feeds, trying to find where Creed was, where the remaining girls were, trying to make sense of a ship that suddenly felt like a maze designed specifically for hunting. Then I saw something worse on the monitors. Security guards, 3 of them, lying in a crew corridor, not moving. Pools of dark liquid spreading beneath them. We ran then, no plan except distance from where we were. The ship was 13 decks and over 900 feet long, thousands of places to hide. But suddenly, it all felt too small, too confined. Nowhere actually safe. We made it to deck 9 before we ran into Gwendolyn, another girl from our group, the last one besides us apparently still alive. She was hysterical, mascara running down her face, saying Creed had killed her hiding partner right in front of her. That she'd only escaped because she'd run when her friend went down. That she could still hear the sounds. The 3 of us huddled in a stairwell trying to figure out what to do, where to go, whether we could somehow get off the ship even though we were miles from any shore in the middle of the night. Princeton's voice came over the walkie-talkie, congratulating us on being the final 3, saying this was the best game they'd had in a long time, that most groups didn't make it this far. He said he knew where we were, that the ship had cameras everywhere, that we should keep moving or it wouldn't be sporting. Then he laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that showed he was genuinely enjoying himself, that this was entertainment for him. We split up because staying together made us an easier target. Worst decision and best decision simultaneously. I went up while they went down, and I heard Gwendolyn scream maybe 2 minutes later through the radio. Princeton announced 4 down, said it was just me and Veronica left, said they'd save us for last because we'd been the most fun to chase. I was on deck 12 by then, near the theater, and I realized I was close to where this had all started. The theater was open, doors unlocked, house lights on, but the stage dark. I could hide in the technical areas, the catwalks above the stage, places they might not think to look. I made it into the fly space above the stage, the area where they store scenery and lighting rigs, reached by a narrow metal ladder backstage. I could see the entire theater from up there, all the seats empty and waiting, the stage below with its trap doors and marks where performers would stand. I turned off my radio so it couldn't give me away, and I waited in the darkness among the ropes and counterweights. My heart beating so hard, I was sure anyone below would hear it. Veronica came into the theater maybe 10 minutes later, running, and Princeton was behind her. I watched from above as she tried doors, found them locked, trapped herself in the theater with him. He wasn't rushing, just walking steadily down the aisle while she backed toward the stage. He was talking to her, saying she'd played well, that she should be proud she'd lasted this long, that it was almost over. She was begging, promising she wouldn't tell anyone, offering money, offering anything. He just smiled that same smile from the nightclub and stepped onto the stage. I made a decision then that I'll question for the rest of my life. There was a sandbag counterweight above me, part of the rigging system, and I knew if I released it, the metal pipe it balanced would drop. I'd done technical theater in high school, understood the mechanics. I released it. The pipe fell 40 feet and hit Princeton across the shoulders and head, drove him to the stage floor. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, metal on wood on bone. He went down and didn't move. Veronica screamed, couldn't process what had happened, and I was climbing down the ladder yelling at her that we had to move, had to run, because Creed was still out there somewhere. We made it to the main atrium and started screaming for help, setting off every alarm we could find, and finally crew members appeared. Then ship security, and everything dissolved into chaos and explanations and disbelief. They found Princeton unconscious on the theater stage, severe head trauma, and they found the bodies of our friends in various locations throughout the crew areas. They never found Creed. He wasn't in any cabin, wasn't on any manifest, wasn't on any security footage boarding the ship. It was like he'd never existed except for the death he'd left behind. 5 girls from our sorority died that night. The cruise line tried to settle quietly, wanted NDAs and payouts. The investigation found Princeton was traveling under a false name, that he had a record under his real identity, that he'd been suspected in disappearances on other cruise ships but never charged. He survived his injuries but claimed to have no memory of that night. Said his brother Creed had been the one in control, that he'd only been following orders. But there was no brother in any database, no record of any Creed existing at all. I dropped out of school that semester. Veronica transferred to a college across the country. We don't talk, can't talk, because seeing each other means remembering. I work retail now, live in a small apartment, take medication for anxiety and insomnia that barely works. I can't be in enclosed spaces. I can't play games of any kind. And I can never forget the way Princeton looked at us in that nightclub when he suggested hide and seek. like he was a predator who just spotted prey and was savoring the moment before the hunt began. Sometimes I wonder if Creed is real, if there's someone still out there who helped Princeton, who got away clean. Sometimes I wonder if he's on another ship right now, in another nightclub, suggesting another game to another group of girls who think they're just having fun. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the only reason Veronica and I survived is because we were more entertaining to chase, if we lived because our fear tasted better to them, and if that makes our survival something to be grateful for or ashamed of. Have you ever played a game that turned into something else entirely? Have you ever realized too late that you were prey instead of player? Let me know in the comments if you think Creed was real or just Princeton's excuse for the monster he actually was. My name is Anya, and I'm 25 years old. I'm a marine biology graduate student, and what happened during my July 2022 research cruise should have been impossible, according to everything I'd studied. We'd booked a dive package cruise out of Miami, heading to the Bahamas with scheduled deep water excursions near remote reef systems. There were 3 of us, myself and 2 friends from undergrad, Leighton and Olivia, celebrating the end of a brutal semester. The cruise line specialized in dive tourism, catering to advanced divers who wanted access to sites beyond typical recreational limits. We were certified for deep dives, had logged hundreds of hours underwater between us, and thought we knew what we were doing. We were wrong about so many things. The ship was smaller than typical cruise vessels, maybe 400 passengers maximum, designed with dive platforms and equipment storage built into the lower decks. The passenger mix was different too. Fewer families and party groups, more serious divers with expensive gear and log books thick with stamps from dive sites around the world. We felt slightly out of our depth socially. 3 grad students with student loan debt using rental equipment while surrounded by people discussing rebreathers and technical mixed gas systems. But the ocean doesn't care about your equipment budget, and it definitely doesn't care about your degrees. Our first 2 dives were standard, beautiful but unremarkable. Healthy coral formations, decent fish populations, the kind of underwater scenery that makes you understand why people become obsessed with diving. The visibility was incredible, easily 100 feet. The water that perfect turquoise that exists nowhere else in nature. We saw nurse sharks and eagle rays, explored swim-throughs and photographed everything. Leighton was documenting species for her thesis research. Olivia was there for the pure joy of it, and I was splitting the difference, half scientist, half tourist. Those first dives felt like a gift, like the ocean welcoming us. The 3rd dive was scheduled for day 4, an advanced deep site near a remote reef system about 40 miles from any inhabited land. The dive briefing should have contained more warnings than it did. Our dive master, a weathered guy maybe 50 years old with skin like leather from decades of sun exposure, seemed uneasy about the location. He mentioned the site wasn't dived frequently, that the currents could be unpredictable, that we'd need to stay close to the group and watch our depth gauges carefully. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that we shouldn't touch anything we found down there, especially not anything that looked like eggs or seed pods. The way he said it felt specific, like he was referencing something particular rather than giving general environmental protection advice. We descended around 10 in the morning, the sun directly overhead creating cathedral light through the water column. The reef came into view gradually, and immediately something felt wrong about it. The formations were too regular, too geometric, like someone had arranged them deliberately. The coral colors were off too, darker than they should be, deep purples and blacks instead of the typical browns and greens. Fish were present, but their behavior was strange, schooling in patterns that seemed mathematical rather than organic, turning in perfect synchronization that natural chaos doesn't typically produce. Leighton spotted the cave entrance about 30 feet down the reef wall. A dark opening maybe 6 feet across that seemed to exhale cold water in pulses. The dive master was leading our group away from it. But Leighton had already started toward it, camera ready, that academic curiosity overriding the caution that keeps divers alive. Olivia and I followed because that's what you do. You don't leave your dive buddy. And the three of us had functioned as a unit for so long that splitting up felt more dangerous than exploring an unknown cave. The interior was larger than the entrance suggested, opening into a cavern system that extended beyond where our lights could reach. The walls were covered in growth that didn't match anything in my mental catalog of marine species. It looked almost crystalline, geometric patterns that reflected our lights in ways that created rainbow refractions, beautiful and deeply unsettling. The water was significantly colder here, cold enough that I could feel it through my wetsuit, and the current had stopped completely, the water unnaturally still. That's when we found them. Clusters attached to the cavern's ceiling, each about the size of a cantaloupe. Translucent membranes showing dark shapes inside that moved slowly. They pulsed with bioluminescence, faint green light that made the entire cavern glow. Leighton was photographing them immediately, getting closer than she should have, and I saw her reach out to touch one before I could signal her to stop. Her gloved finger made contact, and the thing responded, the bioluminescence intensifying, the shape inside moving more vigorously. Then the membrane split and something emerged. It was maybe 4 inches long, translucent like the egg but more defined, with a body structure that didn't match any larvae I'd studied. Too many appendages, segments that moved independently, and a head region that seemed disproportionately large. It swam directly at Leighton, faster than something that small should move, and attached to her arm despite her thrashing. I grabbed her, tried to pull it off, but it had already burrowed partially under her wetsuit sleeve. She was screaming into her regulator, bubbles everywhere, and more of the eggs were splitting open now, the cavern filling with these things, drawn to our movement and body heat. We got out of that cave through pure panic, abandoning all dive safety protocols, ascending too fast, but not caring because staying meant being covered in those organisms. We surfaced near the dive boat, and the deck crew pulled us up immediately. Saw Leighton's arm already swelling where the thing had attached. The dive master took one look at what was embedded in her skin, and his face went pale. He started yelling orders in a language I didn't understand, and within minutes the ship's medical officer arrived with equipment that looked more like containment gear than first aid supplies. They sedated Leighton immediately, wouldn't let Olivia and I stay with her, quarantined all three of us in the medical bay, even though only Leighton had been directly affected. The ship changed course, heading back toward Miami at full speed, and they examined us repeatedly, drawing blood, scanning our skin with handheld devices that beeped and displayed readouts I couldn't interpret. The medical officer finally explained that what Leighton had contacted was known, sort of, a parasitic organism they'd encountered before on deep dives in this region. He said it was some kind of algae variant, possibly from thermal vent ecosystems, that it used host organisms to complete its reproductive cycle. He said they'd treat it, that she'd be fine. But his eyes said he was lying about the fine part. That night, Leighton started showing symptoms that shouldn't have been possible after just hours of exposure. Her arm was badly swollen, skin stretched tight and discolored, dark veins radiating from the attachment point. But worse, she said she could feel them moving inside her, plural, like the original organism had already reproduced internally. The ship's medical bay wasn't equipped for what was happening to her. They kept her sedated, pumped her full of antibiotics and antiparasitics. But through the medical bay window, I could see her arm continue to swell, the skin developing these translucent patches where you could see movement underneath. By midnight, they'd called for emergency medical evacuation. A Coast Guard helicopter arrived around 2 in the morning, the sound of rotors deafening even through the ship's walls. They transferred Leighton in a sealed medical pod, the kind used for infectious diseases, and Olivia and I weren't allowed near her. The medical officer told us we'd also be taken to a CDC facility in Miami for observation, that this was protocol for potential parasitic exposure. The way he said potential made it clear he thought we were already infected, just hadn't shown symptoms yet. The facility was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. White rooms, constant examinations, blood draws every 6 hours, full body scans that made my teeth ache. They kept us separated, wouldn't tell us how Leighton was doing, wouldn't confirm if the organisms had been successfully removed. Olivia and I communicated through notes held up to the glass barrier between our rooms, trying to stay sane while doctors in contamination suits studied us like we were specimens rather than people. After 10 days, they started to believe we might actually be clean, that somehow we'd avoided infection despite the exposure. They explained that the organisms were incredibly aggressive, that they'd found similar cases in deep water divers over the past decade, that the survival rate wasn't encouraging. They wouldn't give us specific numbers, but the way they avoided eye contact told me enough. They also mentioned that the organisms had been tentatively identified as a deep-sea species, something that normally lived near hydrothermal vents at depths humans couldn't typically reach. How it ended up in a relatively shallow cave system was unexplained, but there were theories about illegal deep-sea harvesting operations, about things being brought up from the abyss that should stay down there. Leighton survived, technically. They removed the organisms through surgical extraction, procedures I don't want to imagine the details of, and she spent 3 weeks in intensive care afterward. When we finally saw her again, she'd lost 30 pounds. Her skin had this strange waxy quality, and her arm was covered in scarring that looked like burn damage. She didn't want to talk about what it felt like, what she remembered from when she was conscious during the infestation. She just said she'd felt them growing, feeding, that they'd been aware of her in some way, that the connection went both ways, and she'd sensed their hunger. The cruise line settled with us quietly. NDAs and enough money to cover medical bills, and then some. The dive site was officially closed, marked as hazardous on maritime charts, though I suspect they didn't share the real reason why. The 3 of us don't talk anymore. Couldn't maintain the friendship after sharing something that traumatic. Olivia quit her marine biology program, moved inland to Colorado, as far from the ocean as she could get. Leighton finished her degree but doesn't dive anymore. Works in a lab studying freshwater systems where the worst thing you might encounter is bacteria. I'm still in marine biology, still fascinated by the ocean despite everything. But I'll never do another deep dive. I stick to shallow reefs now, places where the sun reaches, where you can see everything clearly. Because the thing that haunts me isn't just what happened to Leighton. It's what the medical officer told me during one of our last conversations at the facility. He said they'd been tracking cases like ours for 15 years, that the frequency was increasing, that more and more deep-sea species were appearing in shallower waters. He said the ocean was changing, warming, and things that lived in the deep were migrating upward. He said what we'd encountered was likely just the beginning, that there were organisms in the Hadal zones that made those parasitic algae look benign by comparison, and that eventually something would come up that they couldn't contain or treat. I think about that cave system sometimes. about how many of those eggs were still attached to the ceiling, about how many more might exist in unexplored underwater caverns. I think about recreational divers who might stumble across them without recognizing the danger, about how quickly an infestation could spread through a population if the organisms made it to a more trafficked dive site. And I wonder if Leighton was patient zero for something bigger. If somewhere there's a database tracking these infections, preparing for the day when containment stops working and the ocean's parasites find their way into the broader human population. Have you ever touched something underwater that you immediately regretted? Have you ever wondered what really lives in the deep places where light doesn't reach? Share your thoughts below, because I need to know if anyone else has encountered these organisms, or if we were just horrifically unlucky with what we found in that cave. My name is Harley, and I'm 29 years old. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to confirm what's real, what actually happened during September 2020. I was celebrating my divorce, if you can call it celebrating when you're mostly just trying to convince yourself you made the right decision. 3 of my closest friends convinced me to take a cruise, said I needed to get away, needed to remember who I was before the marriage consumed everything. We booked a late-season sailing out of New York, up the eastern seaboard into Canadian waters. 10 days of what was supposed to be healing and rediscovery. Instead, I lost something I still can't name, and I'm not sure I ever got it back. The ship was elegant in that old money way. Wood paneling and brass fixtures, the kind of vessel that catered to an older demographic with classical music in the dining rooms and afternoon tea service. My friends and I were among the youngest passengers, which suited me fine because I wanted quiet, wanted space to think without the chaos of a party atmosphere. The first few days were exactly what I needed. Long walks on the promenade deck watching the ocean, books read in deck chairs with blankets against the cool Atlantic air, conversations with my friends that felt like they were stitching me back together one word at a time. But on day 4, I saw her for the first time. I was standing at the railing on deck 7, watching the coastline drift past in the late afternoon light. And I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A woman standing about 20 feet away, also at the railing, wearing a jacket identical to the one I'd packed but hadn't worn yet. Cream-colored, distinctive brass buttons, something I'd bought for the trip specifically. When I looked directly at her, she turned away, but not before I saw her profile. My profile, my face, my hair pulled back the same way I wore mine. I blinked and she was walking away, disappearing into the crowd of passengers heading to early dinner seating. I told myself it was coincidence, similarity, my mind playing tricks because I was emotionally vulnerable and probably not sleeping enough. Divorce does things to your perception, makes you question everything, including your own judgment. But that night at dinner, Charlie mentioned seeing me on deck 9 around the same time I'd been on deck 7. She described what I'd been wearing, the cream jacket, said she'd waved, but I'd ignored her. I told her she was mistaken, that I'd been on 7, not 9, but she insisted. Got slightly annoyed, actually, like I was gaslighting her about something trivial. The other friend at our table, Alyssa, stayed quiet but looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested she had her own observations she wasn't sharing. The next morning, I saw her again, my double, in one of the panoramic photos the ship's photographers had taken the night before. The images were displayed on monitors near the photo gallery, hundreds of shots of passengers at various locations around the ship. I was in one photo with my friends outside the theater, and in another photo taken at the exact same timestamp according to the display. I was alone at the opposite end of the ship near the stern railing. Same clothes, same posture, but I had no memory of being in that location. I bought both photos, needed the physical evidence, and when I examined them closely back in my cabin, I couldn't find any obvious signs of manipulation or editing. The woman in the solo shot was me, in every detail I could observe. Charlie found me obsessing over the photos, and her concern shifted from annoyed confusion to genuine worry. She suggested I was stressed, that maybe the divorce had affected me more than I was admitting, that perhaps I should talk to the ship's doctor about anxiety medication. The way she looked at me made me feel crazy, made me doubt what I was seeing, even with the evidence literally in my hands. But she also admitted, quietly, that she'd seen me in places I later claimed I hadn't been, that my behavior had seemed off at times, and she'd attributed it to emotional recovery from the marriage ending. Now she wasn't sure what she'd actually observed. That night I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the photos, about the impossibility of being in two places simultaneously. Around 2 in the morning, I got dressed and went walking. No destination in mind, just movement to quiet the anxiety spiraling in my chest. The ship was nearly empty at that hour, just the ever-present hum of engines and the occasional crew member nodding as they passed. I ended up on deck 10 near the bow, where the wind was strongest and the sound of water against the hull was loudest. She was there, standing at the forward railing, looking out at the dark ocean, wearing pajamas identical to the ones I was wearing. I approached slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. And when I was maybe 10 feet away, she turned to face me. Looking at your own face from outside your body is an experience I can't adequately describe. It's not like looking in a mirror because mirrors reverse everything. And it's not like looking at a photo because photos are flat and static. This was three-dimensional and moving and breathing and wrong in ways my brain couldn't process. Her expression wasn't mine, though. She looked sad in a way I'd been fighting against feeling, looked defeated in a way I refused to allow myself to be. She smiled, and it wasn't my smile, wasn't how my face moved when I forced happiness. She said hello using my voice, and I couldn't respond, couldn't make my throat work. She asked if I wanted to know who she was, and I managed to nod. She said she was everything I could have been if I'd made different choices, if I'd left the marriage 2 years earlier when I first knew it was wrong, if I'd chosen myself instead of trying to fix something broken beyond repair. She said she existed because I'd spent so long imagining alternate versions of my life, wondering what if, creating entire fantasy scenarios of different decisions and different outcomes. She said the ship was thin somehow, that the boundary between possible and actual wasn't as solid here as it should be, and that my regret and speculation had given her enough substance to manifest. I asked if she was real or if I was having a breakdown, and she laughed, said those weren't mutually exclusive options, that maybe I was crazy and she was real simultaneously. She told me she'd been walking around the ship for days, living the cruise I was supposed to be living, talking to my friends the way I should be talking to them, actually healing instead of pretending to heal. She said she was better at being me than I was, that she didn't carry the weight of mistakes and compromises and years of making myself smaller. She said my friends liked her version of me better, even if they didn't consciously realize there were two of us. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes, and with every word I felt myself becoming less substantial, less certain of my own reality. She knew things I knew, memories and private thoughts, but she interpreted them differently, drew different conclusions about what they meant about my character and choices. She was simultaneously me and my harshest critic, reflecting back everything I hated about how I'd handled my life. When she finally walked away, disappearing into a doorway that led to interior corridors, I wasn't sure if I'd been talking to a hallucination, a psychological projection, or something genuinely supernatural that the ship's environment had allowed to exist. I didn't tell my friends. How could I explain it in a way that didn't sound like a mental health crisis? But I started watching them carefully, trying to determine if they noticed anything strange, if they could tell when they were interacting with me versus the other version. Charlie mentioned at breakfast that I seemed more relaxed, that whatever was bothering me seemed to be resolving, that she was glad I was finally opening up about the divorce. Except I hadn't opened up about anything. I'd barely spoken to her in the past 24 hours. The other me had, though, apparently, had conversations I had no access to, building relationships with my friends using my face and voice. Over the next few days, I saw her regularly, sometimes from a distance, sometimes close enough to touch. She didn't always acknowledge me, sometimes walked past like I was just another passenger, and that felt worse than the confrontations, being ignored by my own reflection. I noticed my friends gravitating toward her, seeking her out for activities, and I found myself increasingly isolated, the original becoming obsolete because the copy was simply better at social interaction, at being present, at all the things depression and divorce had stolen from me. On the second to last night of the cruise, I found her in my cabin. She was sitting at the small desk, writing in my journal, filling pages with thoughts I hadn't thought and observations I hadn't made. She didn't look up when I entered, just kept writing, and I read over her shoulder. She was documenting the trip from her perspective, describing moments I'd experienced completely differently, interactions with passengers I barely remembered having. Her version of events was more optimistic, more engaged with the world, more like how I used to be before everything became heavy and complicated. I asked her what she wanted, why she existed, what the end game was. She finished the sentence she was writing, closed the journal carefully, and turned to face me with an expression that managed to be both kind and devastating. She said she didn't want anything except to exist, to be the version of me that deserved to live this life I'd built. She said I'd been going through the motions for so long that I'd become transparent, barely present in my own existence, and she'd simply filled the space I'd vacated. She asked if I'd even enjoyed any moment of this cruise, if I'd felt genuine happiness or connection or peace, even once. When I couldn't answer immediately, when I had to think about it, she nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. She told me the ship would dock in 2 days, that we'd have to make a choice before then, that we couldn't both get off and return to the same life. She said it wasn't a threat, just logistics, reality reasserting itself once we returned to solid ground. She said I could let her continue, could fade away, and let the better version take over, and no one would ever know the difference. Or I could fight to reclaim myself, prove I deserved to be the primary version, demonstrate that I was more than just accumulated trauma and regret. Then she left, walked out of my cabin like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I sat in the dark wondering if she was right, if everyone would be better off with her instead of me. The last full day at sea, I made a decision. I found her on deck 12 near the pool area, surrounded by passengers I vaguely recognized, laughing at something someone had said, vibrant and alive in ways I'd forgotten how to be. I walked up to the group and stood next to her, and for a moment, no one reacted. Like their brains couldn't process 2 of me existing in the same space. Then Charlie screamed, actually screamed, and the group scattered, people backing away from us like we were contagious. My double looked at me with something like respect, maybe even pride. And she said I'd finally made a choice, finally demonstrated I wanted to exist strongly enough to make it real. What happened next is confused in my memory. Probably always will be. There was no dramatic confrontation or battle, nothing cinematic. We just looked at each other, and something shifted. some decision made at a level deeper than conscious thought. I felt myself become more solid, more present, while she seemed to lose definition, becoming translucent and insubstantial. She smiled one last time, my smile, but also not. And then she was gone, not walking away, but simply ceasing to exist. And I was standing alone in front of my horrified friends, trying to explain something I didn't understand myself. They wanted me to see the ship's doctor, wanted psychiatric evaluation, wanted rational explanations for what they'd witnessed. But how do you rationally explain seeing double? Seeing two versions of the same person occupy space simultaneously and then collapse into one? The photos from that moment don't show her at all. Just show me standing alone, looking distressed, like she never existed outside my perception. But Charlie and Alyssa both saw her. Both confirm they witnessed two of me, even if they prefer to believe it was some kind of shared hallucination or trick of light or stress-induced group delusion. I got off that ship alone, the only version of me, and I still don't know if I won or lost. The person I am now is different from who I was before the cruise, but I can't tell if that's because I reclaimed myself or because I absorbed something from the double, integrated her confidence and presence into my damaged original self. My friends treat me carefully now, like I'm fragile or potentially unstable. And maybe I am both those things. The divorce is finalized. I've started therapy. I'm rebuilding a life that feels more authentic than what I had before. But sometimes I catch my reflection in unexpected mirrors, and I have to look twice. Have to make sure there's only one of me looking back. Was she real, or was she the manifestation of a psychological break? Did I have a dissociative episode, or did something supernatural actually occur on that ship? I'll never know with certainty. And maybe that ambiguity is the point. Maybe the question of what's real matters less than the fact that confronting my double forced me to decide I wanted to exist, wanted to fight for my place in my own life. But I wonder sometimes what happened to her. If she's gone completely, or if she exists somewhere in potential space, waiting for another moment of weakness when I might let her slip back in and take over. And I wonder if the person my friends see now is really me, or if she won after all and I'm the one who faded. Just a memory of who I used to be haunting my own body. Have you ever seen a version of yourself that seemed more real than you feel? Have you ever wondered if the person looking back from the mirror is actually you or just something wearing your face? Let me know in the comments if you think my double was real, or if I finally just broke under the weight of everything I'd been carrying, because I still check mirrors twice and I still don't trust my own reflection. My name is Colette, and I'm 27 years old. What I experienced in October 2017 started as curiosity and ended with the understanding that some traditions survive because they serve purposes we're not meant to comprehend. My cousin Hayden and I had booked a cruise out of New Orleans specifically because it departed on October 30th, promising onboard Day of the Dead celebrations as we sailed through the Western Caribbean. We're both fascinated by folklore and cultural traditions, that academic interest that makes you think you understand things you've only studied from the outside. We thought we knew what we were getting into. We were catastrophically wrong. The ship was decorated elaborately for Halloween and Dia de los Muertos, marigolds and papel picado everywhere, sugar skull motifs on every surface, staff in costume encouraging passengers to participate in the festivities. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, that particular energy that comes from commercialized versions of sacred traditions. Hayden and I attended the lectures about Day of the Dead history, learned about ofrendas and the belief that the veil between living and dead grows thin during these days. We made our own small altar in our cabin, using photos of deceased relatives on our phones and some flowers from the gift shop, playing along with what we thought was harmless cultural appreciation. On the second night, Halloween itself, we received an invitation slipped under our cabin door. Heavy cardstock, embossed with symbols I didn't immediately recognize. Elegant calligraphy inviting us to an exclusive midnight auction in the Constellation Ballroom on Deck 13. The invitation specified it was for select passengers only, those who demonstrated genuine interest in the spiritual aspects of the celebration. Hayden was immediately intrigued, said it was probably some immersive theater experience, that cruise lines were always looking for ways to create premium experiences for extra revenue. The fact that the ship didn't have a Deck 13, according to the elevator panels, should have concerned us more than it did. We found the ballroom through a service corridor that shouldn't have been accessible to passengers, following small marigold petals that had been scattered on the carpet like breadcrumbs. The doors were heavy wood, out of place on a modern cruise ship, carved with intricate patterns that drew the eye in uncomfortable ways. Geometric designs that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Inside, the room was transformed into something that belonged in a different century, different world. Candles provided the only light, hundreds of them arranged on surfaces that shouldn't have fit in the available space, and the air was thick with incense that smelled of copal and something sharper, something organic and ceremonial. About 30 passengers were already seated in chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a raised platform. And I recognized some of them from the cultural lectures, the people who'd asked detailed questions and taken notes. Everyone was dressed formally, though I didn't remember the invitation specifying a dress code. And there was an atmosphere of anticipation that felt disproportionate to what should have been shipboard entertainment. Hayden and I took seats near the back, close to the doors, some instinct telling me to maintain an exit route even as my rational mind insisted this was elaborate theater. The auctioneer entered through a door behind the platform that I was certain hadn't existed moments before. A woman maybe 60 years old wearing clothing that mixed Victorian formality with elements from various folk traditions, a collision of cultural symbols that should have looked costume, but instead appeared ceremonial and earned. She welcomed us in a voice that carried without seeming loud, thanked us for accepting the invitation, said we were about to participate in an exchange that honored ancient practices of offering and receiving. The way she said exchange made my skin prickle with unease that I couldn't rationally justify. The items brought out for auction were wrong from the start. Not wrong in obvious ways, but subtle wrongness that accumulated. A lock of hair tied with ribbon that was too old, too fragile. Hair that couldn't have survived being handled. A photograph so faded the faces were barely visible, showing people in clothing from a century past. A small bottle containing liquid that moved too slowly, too viscously. Teeth, yellowed and ancient, displayed in a velvet-lined box. Each item came with a story, a provenance that connected it to specific deaths, specific rituals, specific boundaries crossed between the living and the dead. The bidding started, and I realized with creeping horror that people were using real money. Significant amounts, thousands of dollars for objects that had no obvious value beyond the macabre. Hayden leaned close and whispered that this had to be illegal, that you couldn't sell human remains this way. But no one else seemed concerned about legality or ethics. The auctioneer explained that each item came with responsibilities, that the purchase price was merely the monetary component of a larger transaction. She said the true cost would be determined individually, that the items would collect what they were owed, that this was how balance was maintained. Hayden bid on an antique mirror despite my whispered protests, not even particularly wanting it. But caught up in the competitive energy of the auction, that strange compulsion that makes people bid beyond rationality. She won it for $1,500, money she didn't really have, charged to the cruise account without thinking about how she'd pay it later. The auctioneer smiled when she announced Hayden as the winner, said the mirror had chosen wisely, that it had been waiting for someone with Hayden's particular qualities. The phrasing disturbed me deeply. The implication that the object had agency, had been selecting rather than being selected. When the auction concluded after maybe 90 minutes, the auctioneer announced that the items would be delivered to winners' cabins, that the exchange was now complete, that we'd each entered into agreements we'd need to honor. Several winners looked confused, asking what agreements, what obligations beyond payment. And she simply smiled and said the items themselves would make their requirements clear. Then she thanked us for participating in maintaining the old ways, for understanding that some doors needed to remain open between worlds, that this ship traveled routes that crossed boundaries both geographic and spiritual. We returned to our cabin to find the mirror already there, propped against the wall near Hayden's bed. It was larger than I'd thought from seeing it at auction, maybe 4 feet tall. The frame elaborate silverwork that incorporated symbols I recognized from various folk magic traditions, but mixed in ways that suggested either deep syncretism or dangerous ignorance of why those symbols shouldn't be combined. The glass was old, slightly warped, reflecting things with subtle distortions that made the room look unfamiliar, even though nothing had physically changed. Hayden was delighted with it initially, taking photos, examining the craftwork, already planning where she'd hang it in her apartment. But that night, she had dreams she described as invasive. Dreams where someone was asking her questions in languages she didn't speak but somehow understood. Questions about her lineage, her debts, her willingness to serve as a vessel. She woke up exhausted, said the dreams had felt more real than normal consciousness, and she noticed marks on her arms like someone had been taking measurements. Faint lines that faded over the course of the morning. The next night was worse. She woke me screaming around 3 a.m., and when I turned on the lights, she was standing in front of the mirror, eyes open but clearly not conscious, speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. The words were Spanish mostly, some older dialect, mixed with what might have been indigenous language, and she was responding to questions I couldn't hear, agreeing to terms I couldn't understand. I tried to pull her away from the mirror, but she was rigid, immovable, and I could see something in the reflection that wasn't in our actual cabin, shapes and shadows that had dimension and presence. When she finally snapped out of it, she had no memory of what had happened. Didn't believe me until I showed her the video I'd recorded on my phone in panic. Watching herself speak in languages she didn't know, watching her face display expressions that weren't hers, broke something in her composure. She wanted to get rid of the mirror immediately, throw it overboard, leave it in a public area, anything to be free of it. But when we tried to move it, we couldn't. Not couldn't physically, though. It was heavy, but couldn't in the sense that attempting to relocate it caused immediate intense pain, headaches, and nausea so severe we had to stop. I researched the symbols on the frame using the ship's Wi-Fi, found references to binding rituals, to objects used as anchors for spirits, to folk practices across multiple cultures that involved mirrors as doorways. Everything I read suggested we'd stepped into something with roots in legitimate spiritual traditions that had been perverted or combined in ways practitioners would consider dangerous. The auction hadn't been theater or entertainment. It had been actual ritual exchange, and we'd participated without understanding what we were agreeing to. Other auction winners started showing symptoms over the next 2 days. A man who'd purchased the photograph was found unconscious in a public bathroom, and when he woke, he spoke about vivid visions of the people in the image. Said they were demanding he complete tasks they'd left unfinished in life. A woman who'd won the bottle of liquid developed symptoms that looked like possession, periods where her personality completely changed, where she acted according to motivations and knowledge that weren't hers. The ship's medical staff was overwhelmed and confused, treating physical symptoms while missing the spiritual components entirely. Hayden deteriorated rapidly. She stopped sleeping, afraid of the dreams, afraid of what she might agree to while unconscious. The marks on her arms became permanent, like scars or brands, forming patterns that looked decorative but felt ominous. She said she could feel something watching her constantly, not through the mirror specifically, but through everything reflective, every window and phone screen and polished surface becoming a potential observation point. She said she was starting to hear the questions, even when awake. Pressure in her mind, asking her to surrender, to accept, to become a permanent vessel for something that needed presence in the physical world. I tried everything I could think of to help her. I contacted the auctioneer through guest services, but they claimed no such person was on staff. No record of any midnight auction. No Constellation Ballroom existing on Deck 13. I tried to find other auction winners to coordinate a response, but most avoided me, either in denial about what was happening or too far gone to communicate coherently. I even attempted to contact spiritual practitioners through online forums, describing the situation to practitioners of various traditions. But the advice was contradictory and mostly useless, given our situation trapped on a ship at sea. On the 6th night, Hayden's resistance broke. I woke to find her standing before the mirror again. But this time she was conscious and willing, speaking clearly in her own voice, but saying things that suggested she'd negotiated surrender. She said the entity needed someone to help it maintain the exchange, that the auction was an annual event that required a human anchor to continue, that the previous anchor had been released and she'd agreed to take their place. She said it wasn't as bad as I thought, that she'd gain knowledge and power in exchange for service, that this was how these relationships worked in the old traditions. I tried to break the mirror in desperation, grabbed a chair and swung it at the glass. But it didn't break. Didn't crack or chip or show any damage, just absorbed the impact, like it was flexible instead of rigid. Hayden turned to me with eyes that were hers, but also not. And she said I needed to stop interfering, that I didn't understand the honor she'd been given, the roles she'd accepted. She said the ship was a traveling temple, that it moved along routes that connected sacred sites and thin places, that the auction allowed wealthy passengers to purchase connection to the spiritual world, while also providing the energy needed to maintain the crossroads. When we docked back in New Orleans 9 days after departing, Hayden took the mirror with her. She'd arranged special baggage handling, seemed to have resources and knowledge she hadn't possessed before. And when I tried to convince her to get help, to see someone who could assess what had happened to her, she just smiled with that expression that was hers, but wrong. She said she was fine, better than fine, that she'd finally found purpose and connection to traditions our family had abandoned generations ago. She said I could join her if I wanted, that the organization was always looking for people with our bloodline, but I had to choose willingly. I haven't spoken to Hayden since we parted at the port. I've tried calling, messaging, even went to her apartment once, but she's vanished into whatever network runs these operations. I did find evidence, though, once I knew what to look for. News articles about similar auctions on other ships, always during specific dates, always targeting passengers who show interest in spiritual practices. Missing persons reports that correlate with these cruises. People who board and disembark, but then disappear into communities that don't leave digital footprints. Forum posts from people describing experiences identical to ours. warning others to refuse invitations to exclusive events, to avoid ships that sail during liminal times. I've also found the same symbols from Hayden's mirror showing up in unexpected places. Graffiti in New Orleans that incorporates the binding patterns. Jewelry sold in occult shops that features the mixed tradition iconography. Even social media posts from accounts that seem designed to attract people interested in folk magic, grooming them toward these auction experiences. It's operating in plain sight, hidden by the assumption that modern people don't really believe in this stuff, that it's all aesthetic and performance. But I watched my cousin get claimed by something real, watched her accept binding to an entity or organization that's been operating for longer than cruise ships have existed, adapting old practices to new transportation networks. I'm telling this story because I need people to understand that some invitations should be refused, that curiosity about spiritual traditions can open doors that don't close easily, that the veil between worlds isn't metaphorical for everyone. If you ever receive an embossed invitation to an exclusive event on a cruise ship, if you find yourself in a ballroom that shouldn't exist accessing items that feel wrong, if someone offers you connection to ancient practices without explaining the real cost, please walk away. Some exchanges aren't worth what you'll lose, and some organizations have been collecting people for longer than you can imagine, maintaining traditions that never should have survived into the modern era. Have you ever participated in something that seemed like entertainment but felt too real? Have you ever noticed that cruises during specific cultural celebrations attract particular types of passengers? Comment below if you've encountered similar invitations or if you know what happened to the others who attended that auction, because I'm still searching for Hayden, and I'm starting to think the only way to find her is to accept an invitation myself. My name is Lorelei, and I'm 23 years old. What happened to me and my soccer teammates in May 2023 taught me that modern ships still have spaces we're not supposed to access, places where the infrastructure creates its own ecosystem. We'd booked a celebration cruise out of Port Canaveral after winning our regional championship. 7 of us splitting 2 cabins, planning 5 days of partying through the Bahamas and Caribbean. We were loud and obnoxious in the way young athletes can be, treating the ship like our personal playground, pushing boundaries because we'd spent months being disciplined and controlled, and we wanted chaos. The trouble started on night 3 when Jayla, our striker, dared me and our defender Ivory to explore the crew areas. We were drunk enough that it seemed adventurous rather than stupid, confident enough in our athletic ability to think we could handle anything. The crew corridors were accessed through unmarked doors that we assumed would be locked but weren't. And once we stepped through, it was like entering a completely different vessel. No more carpet and decorative lighting, just industrial metal floors and harsh fluorescence, pipes running along ceilings, the constant vibration of engines much more pronounced. It felt like backstage at a theater, all the pretty illusions stripped away to reveal the machinery that made everything function. We wandered deeper than we should have, taking turns at random, laughing about getting lost, not particularly concerned because ships have maps and staff, and we were young enough to believe nothing truly bad could happen to us. That's when Ivory tried a door that led to a stairwell going down, further down than the passenger decks went, into what must have been the mechanical levels. The temperature changed immediately, became warmer, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal and something organic that I associated with basements and confined spaces. The stairs were steep, metal grating that rang with each step, and the lighting was sporadic, every third fixture working while others stayed dark. We descended maybe 3 levels before I started feeling uneasy, that instinctive animal awareness that you're somewhere you don't belong. Jayla wanted to turn back, said we'd proven our point and should return to the party. But Ivory was committed now, wanted to see how deep the ship went, what was at the bottom. I was caught between them, uncomfortable but not willing to seem scared in front of my teammates. We kept going down until we reached a door marked with warnings in multiple languages about authorized personnel only and hazardous equipment beyond. The door wasn't locked. That should have been our clearest sign that something was wrong. That if this area was genuinely dangerous, it would be secured. But drunk logic and athletic arrogance overrode caution. Beyond the door was a corridor that seemed to extend the entire length of the ship, dimly lit by emergency lighting, lined with pipes of various sizes, some cool to the touch and others radiating heat that made the air shimmer. The floor was metal grating, suspended over what looked like bilge water maybe 10 feet below, dark and oily and moving sluggishly. The sound down here was overwhelming, the ship's engines creating a bass rumble you felt in your chest, punctuated by clangs and hisses from the various systems. We explored for maybe 15 minutes, taking photos for proof, joking about how we'd infiltrated the ship's secret levels. That's when we heard the sound that didn't belong. Something scraping metal in a rhythm that wasn't mechanical, accompanied by a breathing sound that was too loud, too labored to be human, but too organic to be equipment. Ivory said we should investigate, her competitive instinct treating this like a challenge. But Jayla and I were suddenly very sober, very aware that we were deep in the ship, with no idea how to get back, and something unknown was down here with us. We tried to retrace our path, but the corridors all looked identical in the emergency lighting, each turn leading to another stretch of pipes and grating. And I realized we'd been stupid not to mark our route or pay attention to what direction we were moving. My phone had no signal down here, unsurprising given we were below the waterline surrounded by metal, and the others were equally cut off. We walked for what felt like an hour, but was probably 20 minutes. Getting progressively more lost, the temperature seeming to increase as we went deeper into the labyrinth. The sounds got closer, not following us exactly, but moving through the same space, sometimes ahead and sometimes behind. That scraping and breathing always just out of sight. We caught glimpses of movement in the shadows where the emergency lights didn't reach. Something large and low to the ground that moved wrong. Joints bending in directions that didn't match human or animal anatomy. Ivory tried to rationalize it. Said it was probably a crew member doing maintenance. But crew members don't move like that. Don't breathe with that wet, rattling quality. Don't leave scratch marks on metal pipes that look like claws rather than tools. We found a small mechanical room and barricaded ourselves inside, using our combined strength to wedge a broken pipe against the door. The room was maybe 10 by 10 feet, filled with control panels and equipment we didn't understand, hot enough that we were sweating through our clothes within minutes. We tried to stay quiet, listening to the sounds outside, and that's when we heard it clearly for the first time. Sniffing. Long, deep inhalations like something was trying to locate us by scent. Moving past our door, pausing, then continuing. Jayla was crying silently, and Ivory had gone pale and still. And I was trying to think of any rational explanation for what we were experiencing that didn't involve accepting we'd found something living in the ship's infrastructure. After or maybe 30 minutes of silence, we decided we had to move. We couldn't stay in that room indefinitely, and the heat was becoming dangerous, headache-inducing, and nauseating. We removed the barricade as quietly as possible and emerged into the corridor, which now felt even darker than before, like some of the emergency lights had failed. We chose a direction randomly and moved as quickly as we dared, trying to find stairs going up, finding only more corridors that branched and intersected in ways that seemed geometrically impossible for a ship's layout. Ivory was in the lead when it took her. We'd just turned a corner into a section where the grating had gaps, where you could see the bilge water below more clearly, and something reached up through one of those gaps with speed that didn't allow reaction. An arm, maybe, or something limb-like. Too long and too thin, the color of things that live without sunlight. It grabbed Ivory's ankle and pulled, and she went down hard on the grating, screaming, trying to grab onto something as whatever had her dragged her toward the gap. Jayla and I grabbed her arms and pulled back. But the thing was stronger, impossibly strong. And Ivory was screaming about feeling teeth, about it biting through her shoe. We lost the fight. 1 second we were pulling with everything we had, and the next Ivory was gone. Pulled through a gap that shouldn't have accommodated a human body, but did. Her screams cutting off abruptly as she hit the water below. Jayla and I lay on the grating, gasping, looking down into the darkness, where we could hear splashing and thrashing and sounds that I won't describe because I still hear them when I can't sleep. Then silence. Just the engine noise and our breathing and the knowledge that our teammate was gone. We ran then, pure panic overriding everything else, sprinting through corridors without caring about direction or caution. I don't know how long we ran, maybe 5 minutes or maybe 30, until we found a different stairwell going up, this one with functional lighting. We climbed without stopping, passing level after level, until we burst through a door into a familiar crew corridor. Then found our way back to passenger areas through sheer luck and desperation. The ship's security didn't believe us initially. They said there was no way we'd access the mechanical levels, that those areas were locked and alarmed, that Ivory must have fallen overboard or was hiding somewhere as a prank. It wasn't until they reviewed security footage and saw us entering the crew stairwell, saw the timestamp showing we'd been gone for over 3 hours when it felt like maybe 90 minutes, that they took it seriously. They organized a search of the lower decks with engineering staff and security teams in full gear. But they found nothing. No sign of Ivory, no tracks or blood or evidence anyone had been down there. The mechanical spaces they searched didn't match what we described, were smaller and more organized than the labyrinth we'd experienced. The search continued for 2 days. Coast Guard was notified. Divers checked the waters around where the ship had been traveling. But nothing. Ivory simply vanished. And officially the conclusion was she'd somehow fallen overboard despite there being no evidence of that on any of the security cameras covering the deck railings. Her family was devastated, demanded answers we couldn't provide, and the cruise line settled with them quickly and quietly. Jayla had a complete breakdown. She was med-evaxed off the ship at the next port, hospitalized for psychological trauma, and when I visited her weeks later, she could barely speak about it. She'd quit the team, quit school, moved back home with her parents, and she was on enough medication that her eyes looked glazed and empty. She told me once, in a moment of clarity, that she still heard the splashing sounds, still saw Ivory's face in that moment when she realized we couldn't hold on, that she felt responsible for not being strong enough to save her. I finished the cruise in a haze of shock and guilt, gave statements to multiple officials who all seemed more interested in protecting the cruise line from liability than finding out what happened. I researched when I got home, spent weeks digging through maritime forums and conspiracy sites, looking for any similar incidents. I found more than I expected. Reports going back decades of crew members and passengers vanishing on ships, particularly in mechanical areas, particularly on older vessels that had been refurbished multiple times. Stories about things living in bilge spaces and ventilation systems, about ships developing their own ecosystems in areas humans rarely access, about something that adapted to life in the infrastructure. Most of the accounts were dismissed as urban legends or explained away by more mundane tragedies, people falling overboard or having medical emergencies in isolated areas. But the details matched too closely. The scratching sounds, the wrong movement patterns, the glimpses of something humanoid but not human, the way people vanished without leaving evidence. There's a theory, pushed by people who'd be called conspiracy theorists, that large ships can harbor organisms or entities that exist in the spaces between human occupation, that thrive in the heat and darkness and isolation of mechanical systems, that occasionally encounter people who wander into their territory. I developed claustrophobia so severe I can't take elevators anymore. Can't be in any enclosed space without feeling like something is below me waiting to reach up and pull me down. I quit the soccer team. Couldn't face the others who'd been on the trip. Couldn't handle the questions about what really happened to Ivory. I changed my major to something that guarantees I'll work in open offices with lots of light and people. Somewhere nothing can hide in infrastructure I can't see. But here's what haunts me most. 3 months after the cruise, another passenger vanished from the same ship in similar circumstances. A crew member reported hearing scratching sounds in the ventilation system near where the person was last seen. 6 months after that, a maintenance worker refused to enter certain lower deck areas, claimed something was living down there, and was quietly fired and the complaint buried. The ship is still operating, still carrying passengers who have no idea what might be in the spaces between the spaces, and I have no way to warn them without sounding insane. I think about Ivory constantly. Wonder if she's still down there in some form. Wonder if what took her was territorial or hungry or something else entirely. I wonder if ships should be regularly fumigated or exorcised, or whatever you do when a vessel develops an infestation that isn't rats or insects, but something that needs darkness and isolation and occasionally feeds on humans who get lost in its territory. I wonder how many ships have these problems. How many passengers and crew have vanished into infrastructure that's too complex and extensive to thoroughly search. How many families have been told their loved ones fell overboard when the truth is something took them from inside the vessel itself. Have you ever heard sounds in a ship that didn't match mechanical systems? Have you ever felt watched in maintenance areas or service corridors? Drop your experiences in the comments, because I need to know if others have encountered what we found, if there's a pattern across different vessels, or if my teammate died to something unique to that particular ship's history and design. My name is Anaya, and I'm 31 years old. I teach maritime history at a university, which makes what happened during my August 2016 Alaska cruise both ironic and terrifying, in ways my academic background couldn't prepare me for. I'd organized a trip with 2 colleagues from my department, Fiona and Trinity, combining professional research with vacation as we sailed the Inside Passage from Seattle. The ship we'd selected was older, one of those vessels with actual history rather than being just another floating resort, previously operated under different names and companies stretching back 40 years. I'd chosen it specifically because I wanted to experience sailing on something with a past, with stories embedded in its structure. I got more history than I bargained for. The first indication something was unusual came during the embarkation tour. The guide mentioned in passing that parts of the ship retained original features from its first iteration in the 1970s, including a section of first-class accommodations that had been preserved but closed to passengers. As a historian specializing in ocean liner development, I was fascinated and asked if we could see it. The guide looked uncomfortable, said that section wasn't on the tour route, that it was used for storage now and wasn't worth visiting. But the way she avoided eye contact suggested there was more to the story than obsolete decor. I have access to maritime archives, most people don't. And that evening, I researched the ship's history more thoroughly than I'd done before booking. What I found was concerning. The vessel had been involved in 3 separate incidents over its operational life, where passengers had died under unclear circumstances. Nothing dramatic enough to make major news, but a woman who'd fallen downstairs in 1978, a man who'd had a heart attack in his cabin in 1987, and a crew member who'd died in a mechanical accident in 2003, all in the same section of the ship. the preserved first-class area that was now closed to passengers. I showed Fiona and Trinity what I'd found, and as academics, we were intrigued rather than disturbed. Death happens everywhere over sufficient time spans, and ships that operate for decades accumulate tragic incidents without necessarily being haunted or cursed. But Trinity, who had a background in folklore alongside her maritime history credentials, mentioned that repeated deaths in specific locations created what some traditions called thin places, areas where the boundary between present and past became permeable. She suggested, half joking, that we should investigate the closed section, document it for our research, see if the reported hauntings common to old ships had any basis in architectural or psychological factors. We found the entrance on our second night aboard, a corridor on deck 5 that technically wasn't restricted, but was unmarked and uninviting. Gray paint and older carpeting suggesting it wasn't part of the renovated passenger areas. No staff seemed to be monitoring it, and the door at the end opened when I tried the handle, revealing a hallway that looked like it belonged to a different era. The decor was pure 70s, wood paneling and orange carpet, light fixtures that were probably trendy 5 decades ago, but now looked dated and sad. The air smelled stale, like spaces that aren't regularly ventilated, with an underlying scent of old cigarette smoke that had soaked into materials over years. The passenger cabins along this corridor were unlocked, converted to storage as the guide had mentioned, filled with extra chairs and linens and equipment. But at the end of the hall was a suite, larger and more elaborate than the standard rooms, and something about it drew me forward despite Trinity's suggestion we'd seen enough. The suite door was different. Heavier wood with brass fittings that had tarnished green. And when I opened it, I felt a temperature drop that was too significant to be just poor climate control. The interior was preserved perfectly, not as storage but as a museum piece or memorial. Furniture from the 70s still arranged as it would have been for passengers. Bed made with linens that looked period appropriate. Personal items on the dresser and nightstand, like someone had just stepped out. There was a quality to the space that felt suspended, like time had stopped here while continuing everywhere else on the ship. Fiona started photographing everything, her academic instincts cataloging and documenting, while Trinity examined the personal items, noting they included a woman's jewelry, clothing in the closet, photographs in frames showing a woman maybe 30 years old with 1970s styling. I found the ship's log in the nightstand, a journal kept by whoever had occupied this cabin during what appeared to be her final voyage in 1978. The handwriting was elegant, entries describing a solo trip she'd taken to celebrate her divorce, her plans to restart her life, her observations about the other passengers and the ports they visited. The entries became progressively darker as the voyage continued, describing nightmares where she couldn't breathe, feelings of being watched, a growing certainty that someone was in the cabin with her even when she was alone. The final entry, dated the day before the newspaper articles said she died falling downstairs, was barely legible. Frantic handwriting saying she'd seen herself, that her reflection had moved independently, that the mirror was showing her drowning even though she was standing in her cabin breathing. Trinity suggested we leave, said the journal was genuinely disturbing, and we documented enough for any academic purpose. But I was reading the entries compulsively, recognizing elements from my own research into maritime disasters and passenger accounts. The woman's descriptions matched reports from other ships, other eras, suggesting either a pattern to how isolation and confined spaces affect psychology, or something more troubling about ocean travel itself creating these experiences. That's when I realized the woman in the photographs looked familiar. Not historically familiar, but immediately familiar. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken during embarkation, the ones all tourists take near the ship's name placard and grand staircase. In one background photo, standing at the railing behind where Fiona and I posed, was the woman from the 1970s photographs. Same face, same age, wearing modern clothing but unmistakably the same person. Trinity looked at the comparison and went pale. Said we needed to leave immediately, that whatever was happening in this cabin was beyond academic research into haunted locations. We tried to leave, but the suite door wouldn't open. Not locked, but resistant in a way that felt intentional, like the room itself didn't want us to go. The temperature continued dropping until we could see our breath, and the lights flickered in patterns that seemed too regular to be electrical malfunction. Fiona was at the window trying to open it, even though we were on an interior cabin that shouldn't have windows. But there was a window now, and through it I could see ocean, dark water pressing against glass that wasn't quite transparent, shapes moving in the depths that were too large and too aware. The mirror above the dresser showed the cabin, but not quite correctly. Our reflections were there but delayed, moving seconds after we moved, and in the mirror reflection, I could see the woman from the photographs standing behind us, even though, when I turned around, the physical cabin was empty of anyone but the three of us. The woman in the mirror was trying to tell us something, her reflection mouth moving urgently. And Trinity, who'd studied lip reading, said she was warning us to get out, to leave before we became trapped like she was. I don't know what I said or did next. But suddenly, I was speaking to the room itself, using my historian voice, acknowledging the woman by name from her journal, saying we saw her and recognized her story and were sorry for what had happened. The temperature stabilized, the door loosened, and the mirror showed only our own reflections again. We left quickly, not quite running but moving with urgent purpose. And when we reached the modern passenger corridors, the contrast was jarring, like surfacing from deep water into air and light. The rest of the cruise I saw her regularly, in crowds on deck, in the dining room several tables away, in hallways late at night. Always at a distance, always watching, and always appearing in photos I took, even when I didn't see her with my eyes at the time. Fiona and Trinity saw her too, confirmed they weren't my projections or breakdown, that something about our visit to that cabin had made us visible to her or her visible to us. Other passengers occasionally mentioned seeing a woman who didn't quite fit, who wore clothing that was slightly wrong for the era, who appeared in background photos they couldn't remember being present for. I researched her more thoroughly when we returned home, found her obituary, and the sparse news coverage of her death. Captain's report from the ship indicated she'd fallen downstairs near her cabin, that her blood alcohol level suggested intoxication, though the bartender couldn't remember serving her excessively. No one had been with her when she fell, no witnesses to what happened. Her family had sued the cruise line, settled out of court, and she'd been quietly forgotten by everyone, except maritime historians documenting passenger deaths. What the official records didn't include was what I found in personal accounts from other passengers on that voyage. Multiple people reported seeing her after her death, still walking the ship, still appearing in the dining room, still going about the routines of a cruise as if she hadn't died. The accounts were dismissed as grief or guilt or the way traumatized passengers processed tragedy. But reading them, I recognized the same details we'd experienced. She hadn't left the ship when she died. Some part of her had remained, trapped in the space where her life had ended, repeating the voyage eternally. I've been on other research cruises since then, always checking if the ships have similar stories, similar preserved spaces where passengers or crew died and something remained. The pattern is more common than maritime companies want to acknowledge. Old vessels particularly seem to accumulate these presences, spirits or echoes or whatever terminology makes you comfortable, tied to the locations where their lives ended traumatically or suddenly. The ships keep sailing, keep carrying passengers who have no idea they're sharing space with people who never disembarked, who are still living their final voyage in parallel to the current passengers. The woman from the cabin, whose name I won't share to protect what little privacy death allows, appears in photos taken aboard that ship by passengers who have no connection to me, no knowledge of the history. I've collected dozens of these images from social media, people tagging their cruise photos with the ship's name. And she's there in the background, a constant passenger on an eternal voyage. Sometimes she looks sad, sometimes angry, sometimes just lost. The cruise line refuses to acknowledge it, has never responded to my academic inquiries about the preserved cabin or the incidents. Continues operating the vessel like the past can be contained by closing a few doors and not mentioning it in promotional materials. I think about her whenever I board any ship now. Wonder how many others are trapped similarly. How many presences are walking decks and corridors alongside living passengers. I think about what it means that she tried to warn us. That she's aware enough to recognize living people and attempt communication. That death didn't end her consciousness, but just changed the medium through which she experiences existence. I wonder if she's lonely, spending decades watching passengers come and go, or if time works differently for her and the 40 years since her death feel like moments or eternities. Maritime history is full of ghost stories, superstitions, beliefs about ships being alive in some way, about the ocean keeping the dead. I used to approach these as folklore, metaphor, cultural artifacts reflecting human anxiety about water travel. Now I understand their documentation, witnesses recording what they observed, even when it defies rational explanation. The ships remember, and what dies aboard them sometimes doesn't leave, can't leave, remains trapped by trauma or unfinished business, or the simple fact that they were between worlds when death came and got stuck in the transition. Have you ever seen someone in cruise ship photos who wasn't there when the picture was taken? Have you explored closed sections of older vessels and felt like you were being watched by the ship's past? Share your encounters in the comments because I'm building a database of these incidents, trying to understand the pattern, trying to determine if there's any way to help these trapped passengers finally complete their journey and disembark into whatever comes after death. My name is Aubrey, and I'm 26 years old. I work in digital marketing with a specialization in data privacy, which makes what happened during my February 2024 cruise particularly horrifying, because I understand exactly how the technology works and how it was weaponized against us. My friends Michelle and Matilda are influencers, the kind who document every moment of their lives for content. And they'd invited me on a Mexican Riviera cruise out of Los Angeles, specifically because they needed someone to help optimize their social media presence during the trip. I agreed because I needed the vacation and thought my technical skills would be useful for harmless content creation. I didn't anticipate those same skills would be necessary for survival. The ship was brand new, one of those smart vessels with technology integration marketed as luxury and convenience. Facial recognition for boarding and room access, AI-powered recommendations for activities and dining, cameras everywhere ostensibly for security and creating shareable moments passengers could purchase. Michelle and Matilda loved it, said it was perfect for content creation, that the ship practically documented itself. I was immediately uncomfortable with the surveillance density, but told myself it was standard for modern cruise operations. That my professional paranoia about data collection was making me see threats in normal hospitality features. On the second day, I decided to test the ship's Wi-Fi security because that's what people with my skills do when they're bored. I wasn't trying to access anything malicious, just wanted to see how robust their network protection was, whether they'd properly segmented passenger access from operational systems. What I found was disturbing. The passenger Wi-Fi had a backdoor into ship security systems that shouldn't have been accessible. And more concerning, there were active monitoring protocols that went far beyond what would be necessary for network management. Every device connected to the ship's Wi-Fi was being actively scanned, contents indexed, communications logged. This wasn't passive security monitoring, this was comprehensive data harvesting. I showed Michelle and Matilda what I'd found, explained that the ship was essentially spying on every passenger's digital life, collecting photos, messages, browsing history, everything. They were concerned, but not panicked. Figured it was probably just aggressive marketing research, that cruise lines wanted data to improve services. But I kept digging because something felt wrong about the scale and sophistication of what I was seeing. The monitoring wasn't just collecting data, it was analyzing it in real time, sorting passengers into categories I couldn't initially determine the purpose of, flagging certain content and behavior patterns. That's when I found the stored video files. Not just security camera footage, but recordings from inside passenger cabins. Every stateroom had cameras, hidden in smoke detectors and ventilation grates and television frames, recording continuously. I felt physically sick, realizing that Michelle and Matilda's cabin and mine had been under surveillance since we'd boarded, that every private moment had been captured and stored on servers I'd inadvertently accessed. When I showed them the timestamps and file structures proving we'd been recorded while changing clothes, while sleeping, while having private conversations, their reaction shifted from concern to horror. We decided to report it to guest services immediately, bring evidence of what was clearly illegal surveillance. But when we tried to leave our cabins, our room key cards wouldn't work. The doors were electronically locked from the outside, and when Michelle tried to call the front desk, her phone had no signal despite being connected to the ship's Wi-Fi. Mine was the same, and Matilda's. We'd been isolated, contained, because my network intrusion had triggered some kind of security protocol. The television in my cabin turned on automatically, showing not a cruise channel, but a live feed from ship security. A man appeared on screen, middle-aged, wearing what looked like a security uniform, but with insignia I didn't recognize. He said they were aware of my unauthorized access to ship systems, that I'd seen things passengers weren't meant to see, that we'd created a problem that needed to be addressed. He said the surveillance was legal under maritime law because we were in international waters, that we'd agreed to monitoring in the terms and conditions nobody reads when booking, that the footage was being sorted and sold to various clients who paid premium prices for authentic, candid content. I realized with absolute clarity that we'd boarded a ship operating as a massive illegal content farm, collecting intimate footage of passengers without meaningful consent and distributing it for profit. The technology integration that seemed like luxury features was actually comprehensive surveillance infrastructure. And we'd voluntarily documented ourselves extensively, provided our devices for harvesting, posted our location and activities publicly for anyone monitoring to exploit. We'd been content creation livestock, and now that we knew, we'd become a liability. The man on the screen said they couldn't allow us to disembark with this knowledge, that we'd need to remain in our cabins until they determined how to handle the situation, that our devices were being remotely wiped to destroy evidence. I watched my phone screen go dark, restart, and begin a factory reset I hadn't initiated. Matilda was crying, saying her entire business was on that phone, years of contacts and content and passwords, all being erased while she was powerless to stop it. I had maybe 30 seconds before my laptop completed its wipe, and I used that time to upload what I'd found to an external server using credentials they hadn't blocked yet. Raw data, file, structures, video samples, everything I could grab and push out before the connection was severed. It was a desperate move, burning evidence into the internet before it could be contained locally. hoping someone would find it and understand what it meant. Then our doors unlocked simultaneously, and ship security entered our cabins. Real security this time, not the friendly staff we'd seen during embarkation, but personnel in tactical gear with weapons that weren't supposed to be on civilian vessels. They confiscated our devices, said we were being moved to secure locations for our safety, that we'd violated federal computer crime laws by accessing ship systems without authorization. The accusations were technically accurate, but completely inverted the actual crime, making us the criminals for discovering we were being victimized. They separated us, put us in different rooms, in what felt like a brig section, isolation cells with cameras watching our every movement. I had no sense of time passing, no way to know how long they kept us there, no communication with Michelle or Matilda. I thought about the uploaded data, hoped I'd gotten enough out to matter, hoped someone would recognize what they were seeing and investigate. But I also knew how easily evidence can be dismissed as fake, how conspiracy theories about surveillance are common enough that real documentation gets lost in noise. After what might have been 12 hours, or might have been 3 days, they brought me to a conference room where a woman in expensive business attire explained my situation. I'd hacked into secure systems, a federal crime with serious prison time. But they were willing to not press charges if I signed an NDA and accepted a financial settlement. The money they offered was substantial, enough to suggest they were terrified of what I'd seen and how much damage I could do if I talked. She showed me contracts, legal documents that would bind me to silence about everything that had happened, that would frame any future disclosure as breach of settlement and subject me to civil penalties that would bankrupt me for life. I asked about Michelle and Matilda, whether they were being offered the same deal. The woman said they'd already signed, were already being prepared for disembarkation at the next port with their settlements and their silence secured. She said I was the only one who'd accessed the systems, who'd seen the full scope of what they were doing, that my skills made me both the biggest threat and the most valuable asset if I chose to work with them instead of against them. She offered me a job, a position managing their data collection and distribution systems, making more money than I'd ever made in marketing, using my abilities to optimize their operation instead of expose it. I signed the NDA. I took the settlement. I got off that ship at the next port, and I've never spoken publicly about what I saw until right now. And even now, I'm being carefully vague about identifying details because the legal consequences of breaking that agreement are real and substantial. Michelle and Matilda don't talk about it either, have never mentioned the cruise in any content. Just have a gap in their timeline where we were supposed to be generating beach and party posts, but instead we're discovering we'd been unwitting performers in content we never agreed to create. But I didn't forget about the data I uploaded. I seeded it across multiple platforms under anonymous accounts, buried it in places where investigators and journalists might eventually find it. I included enough breadcrumbs for someone motivated to trace back to that specific ship, that specific cruise line, that specific corporate structure operating these surveillance vessels. 3 months after our cruise, I saw a minor news article about a cruise ship being detained at port, inspected by authorities, something about privacy violations and illegal recording equipment. The article was buried, didn't get much traction, and I never saw follow-up reporting about charges or convictions. I've been monitoring, though, using skills they don't know I retained despite the device wipes. The ship is still operating, rebranded slightly, under new management supposedly, but probably the same ownership through layers of shell companies. They've upgraded their security systems, made it harder to accidentally access what they're doing, but they're still doing it. Other ships, too, I've found. Different companies using similar technology infrastructures, all harvesting passenger data and content beyond what's disclosed or consented to. The cruise industry has been quietly building a surveillance economy, and passengers have no idea the extent to which their vacations are being monetized. The settlement money is in an account I'm afraid to touch. Feels like blood money, like accepting payment for my silence about ongoing crimes. Michelle rebuilt her digital presence, but something changed in her content. Became more careful, more aware of cameras, less authentically spontaneous. Matilda quit social media entirely. Said she couldn't trust any platform anymore. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We don't talk much, the three of us, because every conversation circles back to what happened, and we're all bound by legal agreements that make discussing it dangerous. I've changed careers, moved into privacy advocacy and digital rights work, trying to address these issues systemically without violating the specific NDA I signed. I speak at conferences about cruise ship technology without naming the company I have experience with. I write about surveillance capitalism in the hospitality industry without providing evidence that would identify its source. I warn people about the true cost of smart ship features without being able to show them exactly what I saw. It's frustrating, necessary, and completely inadequate. The worst part is knowing how many people are currently on cruise ships right now, in cabins they think are private, creating content they believe they control, having intimate moments they assume are unobserved, while cameras capture everything and algorithms sort it and systems distribute it to paying clients who want authentic footage of people at their most vulnerable and unaware. The technology keeps improving, the cameras get smaller, the AI gets better at identifying marketable content, and the legal protections remain inadequate because maritime law hasn't caught up to digital surveillance capabilities. Sometimes I check the accounts where I uploaded that evidence, see if anyone's accessed it, if investigators have traced it, if journalists have found it compelling enough to pursue despite the legal risks. The view counts are low, engagement is minimal, and I suspect the company has people actively working to suppress it, to bury it under algorithmic irrelevance or discredit it as conspiracy theory fabrication. In an era where everything can be faked and nothing can be proven, real evidence of real crimes gets lost in the noise of imagined ones. I think about booking another cruise, different company, documenting what I find, but the NDA makes even that risky. Could be interpreted as circumventing the settlement terms. I think about going fully public, accepting the legal consequences. But I've consulted lawyers who say I'd lose everything. That the contracts I signed are enforceable and comprehensive. That maritime corporate law heavily favors the companies over individual passengers. I think about the other passengers from our cruise, all the people who were recorded without meaningful knowledge, whose private moments are now commodified content somewhere on the dark web or in private collections, who will never know what was taken from them. So I'm telling this story as vaguely as I can, changing details enough to maybe avoid contract violation while still communicating the essential truth that cruise ships are surveillance platforms, that smart hospitality features are data harvesting tools, that your vacation photos are the least of what's being captured and distributed. I'm telling you to cover the cameras in your cruise cabin, even though they'll tell you there are no cameras. To use VPN on ship Wi-Fi, even though they'll say it's secure. To assume everything you do aboard is being monitored and recorded because it probably is. Have you noticed an unusual number of cameras on modern cruise ships? Have you experienced devices malfunctioning or resetting themselves after cruises? Share your observations in the comments, and please check your cruise line's terms of service carefully, because you might be signing away more privacy than you realize when you book that dream vacation. The ocean isn't the only thing watching you at sea. Thank you for watching Mr. Nightveil. These 10 stories should remind us that paradise vacations can harbor nightmares beyond imagination. If these accounts disturbed you, subscribe and activate notifications for more true horror. Share your own cruise experiences below. Remember, the ocean keeps its secrets, But sometimes those secrets find their way back to us. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll see you in the darkness.